I'm going to go ahead and start recording now. I think it is recording. Thank you for being here, everyone. It's hard for me to, on my screen, to see who is or who has already connected. This is a conversation webinar that is sponsored by Division 43, the Society for Public and Family Psychology. The focus of the webinar is the climate crisis, impacts on families, and to get us to also think as practitioners that what we can do to address this issue. And if you are a practitioner, I am a practitioner as well as a researcher, and what I've noticed in my private practice is that people are starting to tell me or talk to me about their anxiety about the climate crisis, whether it influences their decisions to have children, the number of children they will think they should have, or whether they are and unmute yourself in the webinar. So I'm going to try to actually mute. Okay, yes, that will help. And unmute yourself when you want to ask a question. That will be easier. It's a privilege to have Janet Swim and John Fraser with us to discuss, and Susan Clayton here to discuss with us their research on the climate crisis. It's really an honor to have them and have a conversation with them. We also have two special guests who have an interest in the topic or are doing research in the topic, Gonzalo Bacigalupe and Marianne Shalano. I just want to go, I need to tell you that we do not have a conflict of interest or this webinar does not have a commercial purpose. Just need to mention this at the beginning of this webinar. I also want to go over the learning objectives for today, since this is a continuing education program as well. By the end of this program, you will be able to describe the impact of the climate crisis on mental health and family planning. You will also be able to define what climate anxiety is, and you'll be able to describe effective ways of talking about climate change with children and adolescents. I would like to introduce Janet and John, and you just say, because we're going to discuss their research, and also maybe orient you a little bit to frame or the format of this webinar. Janet is professor of psychology at the Pennsylvania State University. She's the Field of Scientific Affairs for the American Psychological Association, and she's chaired the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Psychological Perspectives on Climate Change. She is the past president of the Society for Environmental Population Conservation Psychology. John Fraser is president and CEO of Knology, an independent research group whose for a better world. John Fraser is also a conservation psychologist who studies how our experience with media and community influences learning, attitudes, and motivations for engaging with complex social challenges. He's also the past president of the American Psychological Association, Division 34, Society for Environment, Population, and Conservation. The way this webinar will go is it will look like a conversation our guest will have with us. And some of us are clinicians. I know that Marianne is a clinician, I am a clinician, and Adam here, who's joined us, he's also is our incoming secretary of Division 43, is a clinician as well. So it will look like a conversation, it will be very interactive, and what we hope to do is engage the audience in the conversation about climate change and help you reflect on what you may have noticed in your work with patients in the community. I will start with two questions to our guest, Janet and John. And my first question to you, John and Janet, both of you have been studying the relationships of people with the planet, nature, and animals, as well as their relationship with each other. to understand how these relationships can empower individuals to take action about environmental challenges. Can you tell us more about your research and about the importance of our relationships in this crisis?
Corinne, you have to ask the person in the phone to mute, or you need to mute that person because it's making a lot of noise. We miss a lot.
Yeah, it's the number 314-577. Janet, do you want to go first or should I? And Janet's on mute, so I guess that means Johnny. So I'll start a little bit in ancient history. My work started back in the aughts, 2006, 2007. I was actually working with a friend of mine, clinical psychologist, Vic Pantesco, and I was working at a conservation organization, and we noticed that I was talking about a regular meeting, which is actually very elevated and very angry. And he said, that seems a little out of proportion. So we got talking about what it's like to work in a conservation organization, and we ended up doing an exploratory study of people in the environmental movement. People who are working in field conservation, both ex situ and in situ, people from around the world. So we did a very large survey because I was able to release it through 10 associations to look at whether we could understand this experience of the emotional experience of working in conservation, and whether it generated anything that looked at all traumatic. So quite honestly, what we found was that we could map the symptoms of PTSD from the DSM-5 to the experience people were having working in frontline conservation. What we found, they often described their experience. Most appropriate words for their experience of environmental change was anger, enrage, regret. In fact, we found almost entirely, the entire sample of 150 people, 123 told us that anger was their experience of the emotional experience of seeing environmental change every day at work. And when you think about how trauma is occurring, for people who have learned environmental change and have become aware of what the symptoms are of natural decline that we see as a result of climate change, habitat deforestation, habitat loss, or even just human behaviors that are negative, what we see is that people in the environmental movement are experiencing this constant stress, this constant threat. And so that work starts around 2006, and we were able to demonstrate that working in environmental conservation was traumatic. And then we were talking about this as part of a project with environmental education, which is how Janet and I got working together. So Janet, maybe you want to introduce a little bit of where you started the work.
Yes, I'll do that. So yeah, I started about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer too. I was just confronted with climate change when I was watching actually Al Gore's movie. And from that point, it's like, I kind of knew in the background that there was this climate change thing, but I was there and I thought, oh, this is really important. And I was on the APA Council at that point, and actually I was asked, Sandra Schulman there was leading a presentation and said, well, where is your position of influence? And I started thinking about, well, what is it that I think I can do as a scientist, and how do I combine these things? Because before this, I had studied intergroup relationships, but I also had, as a social sciences, had studied lots of things about social influence processes and behavioral change. And I thought, and actually health research, I did some research on health. I thought, this is really, psychology really needs to start talking about this. And in our department, we have expertise in affect. And so I was surrounded by people who knew a lot about affect and heard a lot of different discussions about them. And we built that area up over time. And so about 10 years ago, I did a survey with our students, the student sample, and asked them about their different emotions about climate change. And I didn't do anything really with it. It was too big of a survey to publish anything on it, but I looked at it. And then at that point, I actually also did a study about empathy in animals, and trying to say, and particularly if we couch people's empathic responses to animals that are hurt by things that people do to them, if we couch that in climate change, do we have the same sort of effects? And it did find that that when you have people take the perspective of an animal, they're more likely to feel empathetic. And so that's kind of the grounding of where I was all this research on affect and thinking about empathy. And then I really wanted to do something applied. And I went to the APA and I heard Johnny talk about this research that he just said. And I said, can I be involved? Can I do something with this? And so then he invited me to be about this educational efforts. And as he kept talking about it, I kept thinking, they're just talking about building hope. Because one of the people in our department studies hope. And so that's where we started doing a lot of research on hope. And hope actually is quite, is related to anxiety in the idea that both of them are called uncertainty emotions, that you're not certain about what's going to happen in the future. And anxiety is that, in a sense, you're afraid of what it is. And hope is a desire. Hope isn't optimism, but it's a desire, and cognitively, the idea that you can do something and you have strategies for change. So went back and forth between this anxiety, but we wanted to develop hope as well, to change people's perspectives from anxiety to hope. And so that's a lot of what our educational program was about. I can keep going where I am now. So from there, when we finished up our educational program, but I'm still interested in affect. So I've done some things that are looking at affect over time for different age groups. And I don't do children, 18 and older is where our research is. But I actually was approached by a student in the fall that she said she was a senior undergraduate, and she said, I think people are really, my generation is really anxious about climate change. And I thought to myself, every generation thinks they're special. And so is there really something special about your generation? And I thought, well, I have this data from 10 years ago. I know we can look at this change. And then actually I remembered that Ed Maybach from George Mason has been collecting data over the last 10 years on affect. And I thought, well, that's probably a better data set. So I asked him and he gave the data sets. And so we looked at affect over time by generation. And my student was right, actually, that there is an increase in anxiety. It's not just anytime anybody's young, they're more anxious. There's actually been an increase in anxiety in younger generations that you don't see over time. And you have a decrease in hope. Anger is pretty
Although, Janet, what we can though see in parallel to this is how the curriculum has shifted from 2010, a land of denial in the curriculum, to the next generation science standards, actually having it as required coursework. So more kids are learning about environmental change and the climate crisis. And we're also seeing a parallel change in weather volatility that is happening over the life of this current generation. We're seeing, since if you think about Superstorm Sandy, Hurricane Rita, the consistency we're seeing in terms of environmental damage is more present in our society today than it was 15 years ago, because climate volatility is at a higher valence.
Right.
So
yes.
it makes perfect sense that there's a lot of bad things happening. They are correct.
There's that intersection between knowledge, you're right, and changes. So, and this generation is learning things, and we hope that they're learning things from like zoos and aquariums as well, where we do their educational impacts. And but I think one of the things that I also just thinking about this topic, this seminar today, was that there's an increase. It's also an increase in the millennial generation. And I think that's important because the millennial generation are the parents of the younger generation. They're in that age group. And so what parents are thinking may also then start impacting what children are thinking. So yeah, the millennials and Generation X are the ones that are reporting the most anxiety about climate change.
I'm wondering, the two of you have started to talk about climate anxiety. Could you help us understand the concept and how it's impacted families as far as you know?
There you go, right there. So climate, I'm glad you brought that up, because the research research that I've done is asking people mostly about how anxious do you feel with different adjectives, or and how hopeful with different sort of emotion words. And that's just one part of anxiety. And this, what we have here, comes from Susan Clayton's research. And that we really wanted to think about, Susan and I have been talking about this, really wanted to think about climate anxiety as different from just being anxious, that there may be something particular about climate anxiety that might be relevant, for instance, in the clinical setting. And so Joe Reiser had written about that: apprehension, anxiety, sorrow, or loss due to the threat and projected consequences of climate change for oneself, humanity, or the world. And then Susan wrote about it. I got that one from Susan's paper as well, but Susan started writing about it in terms of climate anxiety. From mild, can range from mild to clinically significant. And it's consistent with this generalized anxiety disorder in more clinically significant forms. So this is the part that I think is really interesting about being on this actual symposium, is that to have people who are clinicians to start telling us about what they've heard. So yeah, I don't know if you want to add anything in there, either Susan or Johnny.
Well, I guess I was just going to add that one of the things from our original work was that as a cognitively mediated kind of trauma, it's unlike other acute kinds of trauma that you can attribute to an event. This is something that is learned, and then you witness the evidence. And as you start to learn the evidence, everything you see around you in nature is evidence of environmental degradation and environmental change. So what used to be restorative and protective, the trees, plants, walks in nature, suddenly become walks in dying forests, walks around environmental things that are dying. And so in effect, if we think about how we mediate a lot of kinds of trauma, the frequency with which you control those triggers is the thing that it starts to be missing when it's nature itself. If nature leaves you, or if you're witnessing nature as something that is changing in negative ways, then you can't actually go outside without encountering something that is a trigger of this thinking, a reminder of what that change is, because it's around you every day. And so that's one thing that we looked at with environmentalists back 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and now we're starting to see how it's playing out as we're developing this literacy. So even though when Jan and I were working on the environmental education project, and I think we got really good at coming up with techniques for talking about a changing climate in ways that can be understood by a 6-year-old, that knowledge is not necessarily completely without harm, especially if they're living in a situation where a family member may disagree with it. So the things that concern me when we start talking with you folks on this kind of call is the mediation between a parent and child. Is there agreement on the reason for environmental change, or is it dismissed? Are these anxieties being dismissed by a family member who may not see them as concerning? And Janet, I want to bring us back to some of our early research that said that a lot of people, when we ask them how worried they are telling us honestly, but then we say, how worried do you think your neighbors are? How worried do you think scientists are? And they diminish the degree to which others may be worrying. In effect, saying, I may be an exception and I may be worrying more than other people. Turned out they're not. Everybody seems to be worrying about the same, and they're underestimating what everyone else is worrying. So if mom and dad start saying things like, well, don't worry about that, or that's not a big deal, or we can deal with it later, these are the kind of family interactions which can just promote this issue of anxiety.
So I'm wondering if this is a good segue, and I know that you have questions you want to ask us practitioners, and you want to engage us in a dialogue. And I'm going to turn the table to you and give you the microphone in a way and let you ask us those questions.
So we're going to ask people to use the chat box to fire questions at us. Is that how it's going to work, or how's that going to work, Corinne?
They could use, they could answer this way, or maybe we could have Marianne, Adam, Gonzalo answer those questions, and maybe other people raise their hands. What we can do is have people raise their hand on Zoom and to answer the questions, and hopefully I can see them.
So I'd like to add, so the process by which you do this is helpful, but when you're thinking about this, when we wrote these questions out, I wrote them out initially to do interviews with clinicians. And this was written out in January before COVID. So how is climate anxiety dissimilar to different from other types of anxiety? And that point, we're thinking about generalized anxiety disorders or other things that they might bring up. But I'm actually at this point in COVID, I'm interested in how do people see these things emerging with their clients for anxiety about COVID, anxiety, general anxiety disorders, or what is that? What is the experience that people have in their practice with these things?
Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, I see a lot of interpersonal conflict. Couples, families, in-laws, a lot of conflict around who the person next to me who's not taking it as seriously, according to my perception, or the person to the other side of me taking it much more seriously. And sort of lots of mixed emotions and conflict that couples and families are having that I haven't seen before.
So at what point do you think that was emerging? Was that before COVID, or was that just?
I saw it a little bit with climate anxiety before, specifically after the last election in 2016, and some couples sort of facing some of that conflict where one partner voted for one candidate, one the other. But now with COVID, it's just gone way farther and way more common.
So they talk about climate change as well as COVID anxiety. Is this anxiety about the future, or?
Yeah, I mean, I heard more climate anxiety before COVID, and they're both sort of these existential threats, right? And now it's sort of a relief. It's oddly a relief to talk about climate anxiety today and not COVID.
Sorry about that.
It's refreshing.
Well, there is a comorbidity here. So I'm glad you're feeling good about it. But
yeah, since COVID, the focus has almost been entirely there.
Well, I think it's actually interesting when you talk about that as an interpersonal conflict part, because there are gender differences in reported anxiety, and so risk perceptions are different by gender. And if you have heterosexual couples coming in, then that might be something that would be predictable in couple therapy or family therapy, and how that might relate to how they think they should talk to their kids. Is that?
And as you said, you were also saying, depending on voting patterns, we certainly know that, more liberal versus more conservative voting habits are going to lead to different kinds of conflict. Some of the things we found from the early studies, again, these are with adults, was that so after we had the first initial results reported in GRIST and Vox, I started getting emails from people I knew who were telling me about their emotional experience and their seeking therapy. And the triggers are often what you would not expect. The triggers were often urban experiences, like in a grocery store, being in the basically the chip and soda aisle was just too much. And somebody just sat down and started crying, and they ended up having a panic attack and ended up having to go to the hospital, which is when they were referred to counseling. So, that's just one example of some of the examples I was given, but it was often family conflicts, family events, showing up at a family picnic, and Aunt Marge arrives with the big styrofoam cooler, and I know you're environmental, dear, but that's not what I do. And so, these were things that were actually debilitating. We also heard from some of our early interviews with educators that watching TV, for example, one educator told us that after work, she'd go home, have a bottle of wine, and watch National Geographic to cry and get it all out from the day. And it was like, okay, this person obviously could do with more help than just a good National Geographic and a good cry and bottle of wine. So, these kind of, how are people managing this experience and how are they managing it within their family is often something that's a little bit manifesting a little differently, is how I'm going to say it, than we might think. So it may be that, again, what we hear is that it's anger, rage, regret, all of these things that are about lack of control. And so the triggers themselves, this climate anxiety may be attaching itself to other kinds of anxiety, is basically what I'm suggesting here.
Christina Rodriguez has raised her hand. Christina, would you like to say something?
Yeah, so I was curious about sort of generational effects, about what happens when one generation, since it is oftentimes the younger generation that is concerned, having conflicts with their parents, their grandparents, about that sense of urgency and whether or not what other people's experience has been about those generational arguments.
I have experience with well, people are thinking about it. I have some experience with my students. I gave them the assignment to talk to their parents about it. And they were nervous about it, but I gave them scripts and ways to talk about it. And what I found was similar to what we found in with research, that people think that other people aren't concerned, but they are concerned. And that their parents were more receptive to the conversation. And when it was, this is college students, but who have practiced on how to talk about it. But what I found really interesting is that it brought up conversations that people, sorry, somebody's trying to ring me here, brought up conversations that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And they brought up conversations they wouldn't have had otherwise. And the parents, being parents, were listening to their children. And so that was really useful for them to start having this sort of conversation. And they were supposed to try and talk to things that their parents could do. And it was actually really helpful. And they were surprised how well it went. I also had somebody whose parents worked in the coal mine, and that he was afraid of that, but it actually went better. And so I don't know, in terms of a clinical setting, when you have people who already have problems in relationships, that might be different. But it's really an opportunity, I think, for people to talk about it. I'd also think that one of the things that emerges, probably, I'm not a developmental psychologist, but I assume that we know that kids start talking to other kids more when they get older. And so when we're finding younger generations are talking about climate change, and you have Greta out there modeling, talking about climate change, they may start having a lot of these conversations with their friends and peers, and depending on how they relate to their family, they may or may not bring it back to their family.
So Marianne has raised her hand, and I think there's a book she wants to share with us.
Well, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, and this is her book, Our House is on Fire, which is a compelling, though anxiety-inducing read. But I wanted to answer, or try to answer, the first question from a family psychology point of view. You know, family psychology, we're all about a systemic lens, and context is everything. And so when I think about the single biggest change in my clinical work as it affects climate anxiety, as it pertains to climate anxiety, it is this. I also have climate anxiety. Normally I'm helping someone with a problem that I don't particularly have, or that I had a long time ago. But this is a pervasive problem that all of us face. So one of the things I have to be aware of is to what extent I'm projecting my own climate anxiety on my clients, right? So that's one issue. The second issue, and I'm sure Gonzalo is going to talk more about this, is justice. So I am privileged that I have the brain space and the time and the resources to think about and research the climate crisis. I am not more consumed with thoughts of how I'm going to pay my rent payment, or I'm not trying to meet more immediate needs. And so for me, I can talk about and think about climate change, but for many of my clients, they don't think about it because they're more concerned with the immediate need of getting food on the table, for example. And so part of our conversation about climate anxiety has to also be about justice.
I see that Susan said she has a comment relevant to this, and she studies justice. So I don't know if you want to say anything, Susan.
Yeah, actually, if it's okay, this was not related to the justice comment, but to the previous comment about from Marianne about her own climate anxiety. So I did just this spring collect some data from families about children's emotional responses to climate anxiety. It was a small study, and it was done in Australia, so not representative. But we thought this is before the pandemic, but we thought climate concerns were at a fairly high level in Australia because of the bushfires. So we asked parents, if they thought their children were experiencing stress or anxiety, if they talked to their children and sort of what obstacles they faced, but also did they have positive experiences. And about 2/3 of them said that, yes, they thought their children were experiencing some anxiety or stress associated with climate change. And the thing they identified as the biggest barrier was the parents said their own anxiety, and that they were worried about increasing their children's anxiety by talking to them about it, which I think is the wrong. You can understand why a parent would feel this way, but I think that to say, I can't talk to my child because I'm worried about increasing their anxiety is the wrong response.
Although it's understandable, Susan. I mean, there is this sense that climate science is somehow really complicated and that I may not fully understand it. We found this working with environmental educators too. And I can imagine a parent saying, but I don't actually understand how the climate system works. And I can't explain why. And secondly, it is such an enormous global, slow-moving disaster that the scale and enormity becomes something undescribable, right? So how do I talk to a 12-year-old or a 10-year-old about the idea that the planet system itself is in sort of, critical collapse without, it's like, and on a lighter note. So I think that, parents are like anybody, even in the environmental education movement, is feeling a little bit overwhelmed by talking about the enormity of the problem. So it's not unreasonable. It doesn't have to be that big, but I think that that's one of our challenges. And I'd love to hear from some of the other participants here about thinking about that, scaling down the enormity of it and how you have those kind of conversations in a clinical setting.
Gonzalo, I'm wondering also if you wanted to add to the topic of justice and social justice and climate change.
Sure. Can I share the screen just to show one thing? Oh yeah, I can do it. I think I can do it. Give me a second. All right. Oh, I cannot share. You have to enable it for me to share, just to share something. All right. So what?
Can you try now?
All right. Yeah. So we just published this. Actually, came out. It was in the accepted. Now it's in the actual. It just came out last week. This article we wrote about connecting some of the dots between the climate crisis, the COVID, and health equity, and trying to think about how is it that COVID is a very unequal virus. So I'll stop the share. Just I can send the title later and the link to everybody via the chat. But let me say a couple of things. I teach the trauma course, and we read those two references that you share, the Reeser and the Clayton and the climate anxiety. There's a climate trauma actually article. And one of the conversations we do have is about how the climate crisis anxiety, it's really for the privileged. It's imagining that the world is going to change and it's going to destroy. But for most people in the world is being destroyed around them. So they breathe bad air, they drink contaminated water, they don't have places to, water. I mean, the scarce water drought is a big issue. And then people are facing disasters, and they're usually the people who are less privileged. So in some way, the climate crisis anxiety is a construct for the minority, for people like us here, but it is actually a factual aspect of life. So one of the things that I find myself, I'm a psychologist, but I'm a family therapist, but also a public health researcher, is that somehow what can join both kind of worlds, is this notion of we need to engage in politics. There's no other way we're going to be able to deal with this climate crisis anxiety if it's not getting involved in politics. That somehow mentalizing it, making it into a mental health issue, is quite problematic. So when just to finish so that other people can say things. One of the things I've also been interviewing families and teachers in this period, besides doing a lot of policy stuff around the COVID. And one of the things that I have found by chance was that a lot more people are composting, even in their own apartments. They're sort of like figuring out what to do with all those remnant, biological remnants of making food, so cooking food. So it's been interesting how the confinement, and I've been in a country where we've been going 4 months on confinement already. The confinement lead to these conversations about what matters, and just quite interesting. So I throw those ideas and we can go back.
I think that's actually interesting and what's one of the things that I get concerned about without having education about climate change is when people think about what they can do in the United States. There was a survey that APA did, and 83% of the people said they recycle, and that's good. And composting is actually really good, but what they need to do in the United States in particular is not drive or get an electric car, not fly. So the things that people need to have some education about what are the things that they can do within their own life, but I think the politics is really important too. So what is it that they can do to make changes in their communities? So so we're doing some other research about land management. So decisions that communities make about clear cutting to build a highway, clear cutting to build development. Those are people you elect, the policies that are happening. And those are the things that really make a difference on sequestering carbon dioxide. Our land use change is huge. And so the things that people need to do, I think it's important to be consistent across your life and to do lots of pro-environmental behaviors, but there does need to be some education about what can be done and what can be done at a community level, because people will feel like they have no efficacy because they can't change the federal government, but they do have more impact on their local area. Perhaps those are some things that families can actually model as well in terms of how they get involved in their communities.
I mean, I think in the United States, we have this big P politics, like somehow it's about national elections, where so much of the land use work that Janet's talking about can be small P politics. They can be about, community groups and community activities that are beyond the family itself, the family compact, and even talking about it and engaging with 2 or 3 other families or groups or a significant social network that you're part of in some action can help alleviate. The issue is, are we first processing the anxiety in a way that it can be productive? We're not saying it's not real. We're saying that it is something that you need to be able to deal with, because otherwise, people who are going to have angry outbursts, like I see in environmental meetings, or people who are going to be enraged, are actually not going to be politically useful, because they're the people that get ignored because they are perceived as hysterical. And we know that for the most effective political engagement, for the most effective work around rights, we can even look at the Black Lives Matter movement to see where the peaceful action is actually more productive than violent action, than rage. And so for people who are experiencing anxiety, if they are in that stage of processing anger and intergroup conflict within a family, or they're in counseling, that's something you're going to need to manage, or else we won't move them into the political.
I believe, Susan, you had a comment you wanted to make earlier, and I don't know if you want to make it now.
Sorry, I actually did make my comment already. I can make more comments.
We'll wait. I'm wondering, Janet and John, if you want me to show one of the vignettes, maybe client A.
I think that'd be great.
Got it. Okay. I'm going to share my screen. All right. So I'll let you talk about client A and maybe ask the question.
Do you want to bring it? So yeah, I would like you to read through this. and see whether or not this rings true for anything anybody brought up. And I did note, we did want to note that I saw Gary's comment about like, is it related to other topic areas that people might bring up? And that's kind of what this is about. This is perhaps more targeted at environmental topics. But if you have a client, they note about his concern about the increasing frequency of flooding and storms, making it hard to enjoy time with his friends. His friends thinking and talks about environmental policy too much, notes that he has difficulty balancing concerns with the long-term future. He finds himself frequently distracted by issues that supervisors have noted. He's falling behind in assignments of work. And I wondered what you think about if this person presented with some of these topic areas, and what might you do in your relationship with this client?
Well, this is going well. Does any of our discussing group want to give it a shot?
Hi, everyone. My name's Kelsey. I'm a child psychologist, but I work at Boston University in the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders with kids who are 3 to 18. So I'm not, just disclaimer, not an adult psychologist, but we talk a lot about climate anxiety in children in my department, and frequently talk about emotion management strategies and normalization and validation of the emotions that are coming up around these issues, which it sounds like in this vignette is also happening. So what this brings to mind for me is kind of setting the stage for understanding what emotions are coming up, and that is normal and understandable and potentially even expectable from a chronic traumatic stress perspective. But then thinking about the actions that are associated with those feelings and thoughts, and what might be the person's values, and how could different actions bring that person closer or further away from those values, in terms of, problem solving, or figuring out, like we were talking about, community or local politics or greater than community politics. But yeah, zooming out, just kind of placing the emotions, understanding them, recognizing them, and then taking a thoughtful approach to the behaviors in terms of what the actual goals for this person are, and whether or not those behaviors are in line with those goals.
That was great.
Anyone else would like to share what they would do in clinical practice? My best guess is that people do not know. We haven't been trained in that area. And what as I'm thinking about it, is this any different? I mean, if I think of it as an environmental issue, this is different, of course, but it's no different. It would not be any different in my approach than the way I would address racism in the environment. So acknowledging that it is a threat, acknowledging a personal reaction to racism or the climate crisis, and exploring what the individual can do to feel empowered and take actions to address the issue. Just realizing that we will not change it at the individual level. It's a systemic issue. However, how can we empower ourselves and feel like we can contribute to change at the level of the environment, or change at the level of society?
One of the thoughts I had about this, just for this conversation, was the idea that he's reporting on his friends but his concerns are in his family. But the real question I would have is, how is the family talking about this? Is he finding validation at home? Is that family talking about the issue together or not? Or is he internalizing this and not discussing it with his family? Because this environmental trauma, environmental experience, or the anxiety is a mess of work and home. And if he's not feeling supported at home, he's not feeling supported at work. These are the things we found in our original study were leading to things that mapped to the PTSD symptoms that we were seeing. So I think as a family, in a family setting, you folks might want to talk about the degree to which the family is supporting this, or what conversations can the family have so that it's not becoming a drag on the work experience too, where he's probably also not feeling supported.
Interesting, because I don't think I've had a family come to me and talk about climate crisis. I mean, they usually focus on their interactions, what happens at the individual level or between them, not necessarily what happens around them. I don't know if anyone else has had that experience.
I have not either. Usually they talk about other issues, although there's a part of me that wonders if the climate crisis is always in the background, the way racism is always in the background, the way many issues are always in the background.
I think that's a great description. I mean, you know, the issue of racism is very similar to what we're talking about. It is constant, perpetual, and leads to conflicts.
And actually, clients will not bring up the topic of racism until you bring it up yourself. So as a therapist, we have the responsibility to bring up issues that are not discussed, that stay backgrounded, because patients do not know, is this the place to talk about it? So they don't necessarily know that.
Or may not recognize how much that is present in the thing where it's erupting. The story that kicked off our study was literally, you know, an ornithologist in a meeting with me when a new marketing team arrived, and they came in and they brought coffee for everyone in styrofoam cups, and she slammed down her book and said, "I can't work with these idiots," and walked out the door. Because the styrofoam cup was the little thin edge of the wedge that said, if they don't understand that around here we are actively trying to eliminate styrofoam, they can't possibly understand my pain. And so that's what spawned our whole study, was that kind of outburst. And so these outbursts may not look related to what the source is, or what that grinding anxiety is that's underneath the problem. So it's metastasizing into a conflict that may not be where the source is.
I was just thinking that people might not recognize it themselves. If you look at this, I'm trying to think about this, Susan's data from this, actually, when you look at the graph of it and you ask the number of people who say they don't experience this hardly at all, is very low. And so some people may think, or clinicians I think might think, is if you go into it, you might end up having some sort of expecting some extreme response. And climate anxiety can be more, I think I would think about Susan's data in a sense of it's present to some degree, not necessarily that they're over the top, but it's more like a bimodal distribution. Some people are not thinking about, many people are not thinking about it, but there is this section of the people are thinking about it at least a little bit. And it might have more impact on their lives than they even realize. So I was just, for one more comment before we get into this, I know we have let Susan talk, but those two, there was client A and Climate B, which we didn't get to. Then client A represents one of the subscales in Susan's work, and I don't know if you're going to mention that or not, but and that was, I think that was cognitive involvement, and then there's another type that's more of an impairment. But so it's your turn, Susan, I guess.
Yes, Susan, we have 10 minutes left, so maybe this is a good time for Susan to conclude her remarks and tell us what she's heard may apply to the work that we do with families and couples.
Great. Well, I feel like I'm left with the question of how do we fix this problem, but so I won't be able to quite answer that, but hopefully say something that may be useful. And I also just want to really thank you for organizing this symposium. I think it's wonderful that this division in particular wanted to have this conversation. A couple of things that jump out to me from listening to everybody else so far this afternoon. And one is just to get back to one of the points Johnny made very early on, which is that, climate anxiety is, I mean, to some extent, this could be true of other sorts of anxiety, but it's particularly true with climate anxiety that it's a result of interpretation. So it's not so much that you're typically being traumatized by an actual experience, but by your perception of that experience. So there's this ironic thing that the more people understand about climate change, in some ways, the more at risk they are. And people who just don't believe that it's happening are probably not experiencing climate anxiety. But one of the things that means is that your social context matters quite a lot in determining your perceptions and interpretations. But also, I think the social context is really important for support and validation. And I think that it is pretty straightforward, but very important for sort of clinical and family practice. And I think relates to some of the issues that, parents I surveyed brought up, that they were afraid of bringing up the issue because they didn't want to upset their children. I think this is often a similar issue comes up with race. But in fact, I think it's really important that they do bring it up with their children, because otherwise their children are clearly hearing about climate change. And so if they don't feel they can trust their parents to talk to them about it, that itself is going, oh, excuse me. Oh my God. Sorry. This is the problem with a Zoom conference. My cat just knocked over a plant. I apologize. So, yeah, so children need to be able to trust their parents and be able to talk to them about their emotions so that they don't have to feel that there's something wrong with their emotional response. And then kind of a third issue that I think really came up in a lot of what people said was many times for those of us who are not clinical psychologists or practitioners are focused on trying to get people to change their behavior. But increasingly, there's this awareness of the importance of thinking about people's emotional well-being. And can you address those both at once, or are they in competition with each other? Does encouraging people to take action on climate change kind of make them think more about the problem and result in this kind of stress and triggering response that, again, Johnny talked about some examples of. And I don't think there's one answer, a single answer for that. I think clearly Janet was getting at the point of different levels of climate anxiety. Most of us are a little bit anxious, but there do seem to be some people who are extremely anxious at a level that's impairing their ability to function. And for those extremely anxious people, different strategies might be necessary. They may need help in pulling back from the issue in some way. But for people who are experiencing moderate levels of anxiety, part of it has to do with maybe a lack of social validation, a lack of perceived efficacy. So in fact, helping them to think about how they can personally address the issue can improve their ability to cope with it. And some of you may be familiar with Maria Ohala's work, and she has studied children a lot and how they cope with climate change. And she's talked about emotion-focused coping and problem-focused coping, but also meaning-focused coping, and how normally we think problem-focused coping is the best, but if it's a very difficult to solve problem, that might actually increase stress. And she did find that children, I think these were about 10 to 12 years old, who were focused on problem-focused coping with regard to climate change, their well-being was actually low. But if they looked for meaning in the problem, and that could be meaning by getting engaged in the struggle, or meaning by hope for the future, or meaning by finding sources of trust in other people, that actually helped them not only to engage with the struggle, but also to enhance their own individual well-being. So I think, without wanting to be too Pollyanna-ish, there are times that sort of a therapeutic consideration and a social, societal well-being consideration can both be advanced at the same time. But of course, the difficult issue is, when is that true and when is it not true? And I guess I will stop there and see if anybody wants to add anything else or raise any additional questions. And yeah, I see Johnny had some comments about meaning-focused coping as well.
Yeah, I mean, for those that aren't seeing the comment box, I just think that the more we talk about as families about what we can all do together, I think we create a place for activity that can help people feel acceptance of their own anxiety and fear. It validates it and produces those dialogues that can be really useful. Even if it's not the heart of the conflict within the family, it may be able to reduce the anxiety as that thing people carry with them like a brick in their pocket.
We only have 3 minutes left. I don't know if someone wants to ask the last question. If you do, raise your hand. Nope. Well, I just want to end by thanking everyone for participating in this conversation. It was very enlightening. It was a pleasure to have Janet, John, Marianne, Susan, Adam, and Gonzalo also be our special guest today. And I hope we can have other conversations like this one to maybe have an impact on, a positive impact on the planet and its well-being, as well as the well-being of individuals all over the world. I want to remind the participant to complete the survey if you would like to receive the continuing education credit. And it was sent to you via email. If you have any questions about the survey, please email Linda Burcross, who organized the C part of it. Thank you, everyone. And I hope to see you in person next year at APA.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.